Hey guys, so in the last lesson we were talking about the nervous system, and we talked about the difference between the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. And the central nervous system is made up of both the brain and the spinal cord. Today we're going to go in depth into all of the different lobes and structures of the brain. So for this lesson on the brain, we're going to be going over the 3 different regions of the brain. We're going to be going over all of the different structures and their functions. And you also need to know the different lobes of the cerebrum and their job. So the brain is the regulation center for the nervous system. It regulates pretty much everything that happens in the nervous system except for our reflex arcs, which are controlled by the spinal cord instead. The brain maintains homeostasis in the body by processing and transmitting information. So it's going to process information that's coming from your senses and then transmit kind of like directions on how to respond to that information to your muscles or glands and other effectors and stuff like that. This is how we deal with changes to not only our external environment, but also our internal environment. The brain's also responsible for reasoning, learning, memory, language, and speech. And there are 3 kind of general categories of regions of the brain. These are the hindbrain, the midbrain, and the forebrain. So the forebrain is made up of the cerebrum, the thalamus, and the hypothalamus. The midbrain is kind of right here in the middle of the brain, and then the hindbrain is made up of the cerebellum, medulla oblongata, and pons. So we'll start with the hindbrain. The cerebellum controls fine voluntary motor skills. So when we're talking about fine skills, we're talking about things that are like small movements. So like, for example, writing or like doing your eyeliner or anything that requires you to be fairly precise in your movements would be those fine voluntary motor skills. It also receives information from specialized sensory receptors called proprioceptors, which essentially are located in like your muscles and stuff, and they detect how your body is like positioned. So when it comes to your like posture and just like how you like sit and interpreting that information, all of that is the cerebellum. The medulla oblongata joins the spinal cord to the brain. It controls involuntary responses like blood pressure and breathing rate. And then the pons just moves information between the right and left side of the cerebellum. Then we have, oh, and so by the way, your cerebellum is at the very back of the head back here. So the pons is just moving information between the cerebellum. But both the pons and the medulla oblongata are kind of close to like the brainstem area. Okay, then we get the midbrain, which is actually the part of the brainstem. This relays both visual and auditory information between the hindbrain and the forebrain. It also helps with like controlling your eye movement, so like the muscles that control where your eyes are. And then we get to the forebrain, which is the most complex area of the brain. There we find the thalamus, which essentially just connects the hindbrain and the forebrain, and any sensory information that's coming into the brain needs to be directed to the right part of the cerebrum, and that's the job of the thalamus. So I picture the thalamus kind of like a traffic cop that is directing incoming signals to like the right place, like you over there, you that way. Then we have the hypothalamus, which helps maintain homeostasis by coordinating nerve and hormone function. So in the next chapter, we're going to go all into the endocrine system, which is the system of hormones, essentially, which is almost entirely controlled by the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is really important when it comes to endocrine function, which is hormone function, and also your nervous system. It coordinates with the pituitary gland, which is like a little teardrop-shaped gland underneath the hypothalamus. The pituitary gland is told by the hypothalamus when to release different hormones and stuff like that, also when to start producing different hormones. And the hypothalamus is responsible for controlling things like body temperature, heart rate, and blood pressure. The hypothalamus is also responsible for your like stress responses. It's sometimes said that the hypothalamus is in charge of the 4 F's of the body, which are like your fight and flight response, so your stress response, as well as feeding and mating. Then we get to the cerebrum, which is the largest part of the brain. Like most of like this part of the brain is all cerebrum. It is divided into right and left hemispheres, which your cerebellum also is. And then it's also further divided into 4 different lobes. It's also the center for your memory, your consciousness, language, and responding and interpreting sensory information. So there are 4 different lobes of the cerebrum. Those lobes are on both sides, so in both hemispheres. You have the frontal lobe, which is up near the front of the head, up here. This controls your voluntary muscles, so like moving your arms and legs and stuff like that. Also linked to your personality and other intellectual activities like memorizing stuff. And then you have the temporal lobe, which is like around here, like where your temples are and around the front. That is linked to both visual and auditory information in that kind of temple area. Also linked to memory and understanding speech. Then you have the parietal lobe, up here kind of. That helps interpret information about touch and temperature, as well as emotions and body positioning. I had a student a couple of years ago that remembered the parietal lobe was like you can feel a hug because it's like feelings, but also like touch and temperature. And then the occipital lobe is at the back here. It's just associated with vision. The sensory areas of the cerebrum receive information from your sensory receptors, and then the motor areas control the motor effectors, and then the association areas just kind of coordinate the processing of all of this different information. You also have something called the corpus callosum, which is a bundle of nerves that connects the right and left hemispheres. It allows them to communicate with each other. You also have the cerebral cortex, which is like the wrinkly outside of the cerebrum. It's made of gray matter, and it has all of those folds in order to increase surface area. This is where a lot of your thinkings and feelings and personalities are. And then at the bottom of the temporal lobe is the olfactory bulb, which is responsible for smell. Okay, so this is what those different lobes look like. Again, we have the frontal lobe at the front of the head, the temporal lobe around the temples, the parietal lobe, which is kind of this area of the head, and then at the very back, you have the occipital lobe, and then down underneath there, you have the cerebellum. And then you can see on here as well the pons and the medulla oblongata, which are kind of near the brainstem area. They're just below the brainstem. Okay, so this just kind of summarizes, if you will, how all those different areas are related. So again, we have the 3 main regions, the hindbrain, midbrain, and forebrain. In the hindbrain, we have the medulla oblongata, cerebellum, and pons. In the forebrain, we have the cerebrum, thalamus, and hypothalamus. And then within the cerebrum, you have those different lobes, so the frontal lobe, temporal lobe, parietal lobe, and occipital lobe. There are different diseases that affect the brain. We can use MRI or PET scans, which can essentially map brain function and screen for diseases without actually having to like get into someone's brain. Alzheimer's disease is one of the more common diseases of the brain. It is progressive and degenerative, which means that over time your brain essentially just degenerates more and more and more. Often linked to aging, though the cause is unknown. Essentially what happens is you have like these tangles of neurons that start to grow and behave abnormally, and the tangles eventually get like so tight and condensed that they kill off the neuron. And then as more neurons die, the brain function decreases more and more. Okay, this is just another diagram of what kind of the different areas of the brain are. This kind of cauliflowerish looking area is our cerebellum. These two bumps kind of on the below the brainstem area are the pons at the top and the medulla oblongata underneath. The midbrain is just right in the middle here. This nice big circle, this pale circle here is the thalamus. In order to find the hypothalamus, I usually find the pituitary gland first. So this right here, this little teardrop shape is the pituitary gland. And then just right above that is our hypothalamus. You don't need to know the ventricle there. You do need to know this corpus callosum, which kind of circles around the outside of the thalamus here. That again connects the right and left hemisphere. What else? The temporal lobe is down at the bottom here. Frontal lobe, this whole front area. Parietal lobe, back area, and then at the very back, but not the cerebellum, we have the occipital lobe. This is what it would look like in real life. These brains, by the way, if we're looking at this brain right here, this is someone who's facing like this, like downwards. This is the like brain stem coming out this way. So it would be someone kind of like lying facing downwards. So these are not human brains. They're probably sheep by the looks of it. And this brain at the bottom, again, this is the brain stem. So someone lying down but facing that way. Okay, this is just another diagram of the brain. This person is facing that direction. So here, this again kind of cauliflowerish area is our cerebellum. This whole outside region is all the cerebrum. The actual like wiggly parts on the outside are the cerebral cortex. The different lobes of the cerebrum are the occipital lobe at the back, the parietal lobe kind of back top, the frontal lobe at the front, and then underneath this area in here is the temporal lobe, which is also where the olfactory bulb would be. Then this kind of circular area in here is the thalamus. Above that, we have the corpus callosum, which connects the two hemispheres of the cerebrum. This little teardrop shaped area is the pituitary gland, and then above that, we have the hypothalamus. And then on the kind of connecting to the spinal cord, we have the pons at the top. I think of this as like a letter P for pons, and then the medulla oblongata underneath that. Okay, that's all. Let me know if you have any questions.